The wind howled across the empty plains like a ghost that had forgotten its name. Snow whipped through the cracks of the old railway station, piling against the wooden doors, swallowing the sound of the world. The last train had long gone, its echo fading into the white abyss. All that remained was silence, and a woman sitting alone on a splintered bench. Her name was Clara Marin, though no one had spoken it in days. Wrapped in a threadbare shawl, her hands trembled as she clutched a small suitcase, the kind that carried a lifetime's worth of memories, or maybe just enough to keep her heart from breaking apart completely. Her eyes, red from the cold and from crying, stared at the rails disappearing into the storm. She had fallen asleep waiting. And by the time she opened her eyes, the station master was gone, the lamps were dying, and the train, her only way out of that godforsaken valley, had vanished into the blizzard. For a moment, she thought maybe it was for the best. Where she was going didn't matter anymore. The man she loved was buried 2 days behind her, under a cedar tree outside a mining town called Silver Bend. She'd stayed through the burial, the silence, the pitying looks. But when they covered his grave, something inside her froze. And now she sat in that station not knowing if she wanted to reach the next town, or if she cared to. The snow pressed harder against the glass, rattling the windows like fingers begging to come inside. The lantern light flickered low. She could hear the groaning timbers of the station roof, the sigh of the wind crawling beneath the door. And just when she thought the world had gone completely still, a shadow appeared beyond the snow. At first it was only a shape. A dark figure leading a horse, half swallowed by the storm. Then came the sound of hooves crunching through frost, a deep voice calling out over the wind. "Anyone still here?" Clara froze. Her heart beat faster. Fear, maybe hope, she couldn't tell. The door creaked open, and a burst of cold air rushed in, carrying with it a man wrapped in a long duster coat, hat pulled low, snow clinging to his shoulders. He stamped his boots, shut the door behind him, and turned toward her. For a long second neither spoke. The man, tall, rugged, with lines of weariness cut deep into his face, nodded slightly, his eyes scanning the empty room. "Thought the station was closed," he said. "Didn't expect company? I missed the train," Clara answered softly. Her voice trembled more than she wanted it to. "I fell asleep." He gave a faint smile, the kind that barely reached his eyes. "Happens to the best of us." He walked toward the stove, knelt, and tossed in a handful of coal from the scuttle. The fire crackled to life again, chasing away some of the chill. "You got anywhere to go?" She hesitated. The question hit harder than it should have. "Not really," she murmured. "I was headed west, but I suppose the west can wait." He looked at her for a moment, as if trying to read something between her words. Then he nodded slowly. "Name's Elias Grant," he said, offering a gloved hand. She took it, her fingers small and cold against the rough leather of his. Clara Marin. Outside, the storm thickened, erasing everything. The station became their entire world, a wooden island in a sea of white. They sat by the fire, the silence between them strangely comfortable. Two strangers, both running from something, both caught in a storm neither of them had planned for. Elias took off his hat, brushed snow from his coat, and leaned back. "You from Silver Bend, ma'am?" She looked up sharply. "How'd you know?" He shrugged. "Your suitcase. Tag says Silver Bend. That's a hard place to leave." Clara's lips trembled. "It's a harder place to stay." Elias didn't press her. He just nodded again, eyes drifting toward the fire. "I lost someone there once too," he said quietly. "Guess that's why I recognize the look." For the first time she met his gaze, really looked at him. There was a sadness there, deep and steady, the kind that doesn't fade with time. She wanted to ask who he'd lost, but something in the heaviness of his tone stopped her. Instead, she whispered, "The blizzard. How long do you think it'll last?" He glanced at the frosted window. "Long enough for us to talk, I reckon." And so they did. Hours passed. The fire dimmed and was fed again. They shared stories, not all of them complete, not all of them true. Just fragments of who they'd been before the world had broken them. She told him about the letters she never sent, the wedding dress folded away in her bag. He told her about the ranch he'd built with his brother, and the night that brother never came home. At some point, Clara realized her hands had stopped shaking. At some point, Elias realized the station no longer felt empty. When dawn finally came, pale and trembling through the snow, the storm had quieted. The world outside lay buried in white, untouched and pure. Elias stood, brushed off his coat, and turned to her. "Road'll be bad for a while," he said, pulling on his gloves. "But my horse can make it if we start slow. There's a ranch a few miles south. You'll have food, warmth, maybe a ride west when the track's clear." Clara blinked, unsure what to say. "You'd take me there?" He smiled faintly. "Wouldn't be right to leave someone stranded. Besides," his eyes softened, "company makes the road less lonely." She looked at him, at the door, at the blinding snow beyond, and something deep inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her journey after all. "All right," she said. "I'll come." Elias opened the door, the cold rushing in again. "Stay close," he said, and as they stepped into the white silence together, two lonely souls bound by loss and circumstance, the storm that had once divided them now carried them both towards something neither of them expected, the fragile beginning of warmth. The storm had calmed, but the world it left behind was silent, a white desert where sound vanished before it could echo. The railway station stood behind them like a ghost, half buried in snow, its windows frosted and still. Clara turned once to look back, her eyes lingering on the smoke that still drifted weakly from the chimney, then followed Elias down the frozen trail. His horse, a tall chestnut mare with frost clinging to her mane, pawed at the snow impatiently. Elias patted her neck, his voice low and calm. "Easy, Dawn. We've got company today." He lifted Clara's small suitcase onto the saddle, tied it behind, and then turned to her. "You ever ridden in weather like this?" She shook her head. Her lips were pale, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Never been this far north before," he smiled faintly, offering his hand. "Then today you learn." She hesitated, looking at his gloved hand, then took it. His grip was firm, reassuring. He helped her mount, steadying her with care, then swung up behind her. The warmth of his coat pressed lightly against her back, as he wrapped one arm around the reins, and the other, just enough, around her waist to keep her steady. The horse moved forward, hooves breaking through the crusted snow. The wind had softened to a whisper, brushing against their faces like cold breath. Around them the plains stretched endless and white, the horizon swallowed by mist. For the first hour they didn't speak. There was something sacred in the quiet. The sound of the horse breathing, the faint jingle of tack, the crunch of ice beneath hooves. Clara's eyes traced the horizon, the endless whiteness that made her feel both small and infinite at once. Then, after a long while, she said softly, "You really think there's a ranch out there?" Elias chuckled under his breath. "There's always a ranch somewhere. Out here they rise from the snow like memories. Hard to see until you're right on top of them." She smiled faintly, pulling her shawl tighter. "And it's yours?" "Used to be," he said after a pause. "I built it with my brother. We called it the Grant Range. Place had 40 head of cattle, a small creek, and a porch that faced the sunset. We were going to grow old there, but—" He stopped, the silence between his words heavier than the snow. Clara waited, feeling the weight of his memory through the air. "But one night," he continued, "a fire took the barn. My brother tried to save the horses. I didn't make it in time." Her breath caught. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once. "So am I. Some nights I still hear the fire when I close my eyes. That's why I don't stay anywhere long anymore, just keep moving." The mare slowed to cross a frozen creek, and Clara turned her head slightly, just enough to see his face, his eyes distant, fixed somewhere far beyond the snow. She wanted to say something comforting, but no words felt right. So she said the only truth she could offer. "I know what it's like to leave a grave behind and keep walking." Elias looked at her then, really looked. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, the cold didn't seem so cruel. Hours passed. The sun fought its way through thin clouds, casting pale light across the plains. They stopped at a ridge, where Elias dismounted and helped her down. Below them lay a valley dusted with snow, and in the middle, a faint trail of smoke rising from a chimney. "There," he said quietly. "That's the Carter place. They take in travelers sometimes. If we're lucky, they'll have soup on the fire." Clara smiled, though her lips trembled from exhaustion. "Soup sounds like heaven." They led the horse down the slope. The snow was deeper here, soft and heavy. Clara stumbled once, and Elias caught her by the arm before she could fall. His hand lingered, not by accident, not for long, just long enough for both of them to feel that small spark neither dared name. "Careful," he said softly. "Snow can be deceiving. So can people," she replied. And for a heartbeat they both smiled, tired, honest smiles, the kind shared by those who've been hurt enough to recognize gentleness when they find it. By the time they reached the Carter ranch, dusk was falling again. A lantern glowed faintly in the window, smoke curling steady into the air. Elias knocked, and after a moment, the door opened to reveal a kind-faced woman wrapped in a shawl and apron. "Lord above," she gasped. "You two out in this weather? Come in, come in." The warmth hit them like a memory. Firelight, the smell of stew, the sound of logs popping in the hearth. The Carters were kind, quiet people. They fed them without questions, offered blankets, and listened only when Elias spoke of the storm and the stranded station. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the fire had burned low, Clara sat near the window, watching snowflakes drift like feathers in the dark. Elias stood by the door, hat in his hands, speaking softly with Mr. Carter. When he came back, his expression was thoughtful. "Tracks won't clear for another few days," he said. "Carter says we can stay till then." Clara nodded, eyes lowered. "I appreciate it." Elias studied her a moment. "You'll be all right here, Clara." Something about the way he said her name made her look up. "And you?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Haven't decided yet." The firelight flickered across their faces, hers soft and uncertain, his tired but warmed by something new. In that quiet ranch house buried in snow, two people who'd sworn never to feel again began to thaw, and as the storm rebuilt itself beyond the hills, Clara realized something she hadn't felt in months. She didn't want him to leave when the roads cleared. Morning came slow, as if the sun itself had hesitated before climbing over the snowy ridge. The storm was gone, leaving behind a world so still it felt like a painting. White fields stretching into forever, fences half buried, the sky soft and silver with lingering frost. Inside the Carter ranch, warmth lingered in every corner, a thin veil of smoke above the hearth, the scent of bread rising, the sound of quiet life. Clara awoke to the sound of boots on wooden floorboards. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then she saw the log walls, the soft quilt pulled up to her chin, and the faint crackle of the fire still burning low. And then she saw him, Elias, standing by the window, watching the morning through the frost. His silhouette, outlined by pale light, looked steady, unshaken, yet somehow lost. He turned when she stirred. "Morning," he said softly, voice low and rough from sleep. "Morning," she echoed, her voice still wrapped in dream. He nodded toward the table. Mrs. Carter made coffee. "Strong enough to wake the dead," she smiled, sitting up. "That might be exactly what I need." They shared a quiet breakfast. Mrs. Carter hummed near the stove. Mr. Carter came and went, feeding the horses outside. But between Clara and Elias, the silence was not empty. It was gentle, almost protective. Every glance held something unspoken. Every small gesture, the way he refilled her cup, the way she folded his gloves to dry, carried a kind of tenderness that neither dared acknowledge. After breakfast, Elias pulled on his coat. "I'm going to help Carter clear the path to the barn," he said. "Snow's too heavy for him alone," Clara nodded. "I'll help Mrs. Carter here." He gave a faint smile, tipping his hat. "You'll have her kitchen shining by noon, I bet. You doubt me?" she teased. He chuckled, a small, quiet laugh, but real. "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." The day stretched slow and peaceful. Clara scrubbed dishes, mended a torn sleeve for Mrs. Carter, and stared out the frosted window more times than she'd admit. Each time she saw him, moving through the snow, shoulders strong, voice calm as he worked with Carter. Something stirred in her chest, something she thought had died when the grave closed over her past life. By afternoon, the men came in with frost in their beards and smiles in their eyes. Elias hung his coat, and when his gaze met hers across the warm kitchen, it lingered. Later, after supper, when the Carters had gone to bed, Clara sat by the dying fire. Elias remained at the table, cleaning the edge of his revolver, an old scratched thing that looked like it carried a story too. "You always keep that close?" she asked quietly. He looked up. "Habit," he said. "You learn not to trust silence out here. But there's no danger now." He gave a small smile. "That's what people say right before trouble comes." She folded her hands in her lap. "You sound like someone who's lost more than a brother." Elias's hand stilled. The room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the clock above the mantel. "I lost trust," he said after a long moment. "In people, in the road, maybe even in myself. That's harder to bury than a man." Clara's eyes softened. "And yet, you stopped to help a stranger at a frozen station." He looked at her then. Really looked. And something in his expression broke open. "Maybe I was trying to prove I still could." Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire cracked softly, casting orange light across the room. Outside, the wind had gone still. Clara's voice came almost as a whisper. "You did more than help. Elias, you reminded me that not all endings are meant to stay that way." He set the revolver down, leaned back in his chair, and watched her in the flickering light. "And what about you, Clara? What were you running from?" She hesitated. Her throat tightened. A love that ended too soon. A life that felt finished. He nodded slowly. "Then maybe the storm wasn't meant to trap us. Maybe it was meant to stop us." "To stop us?" she asked, "from leaving before we were ready." The fire dimmed. She rose from her chair, crossed the floor, and stood near the window. Outside, the night was silver, calm, untouched. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that maybe we meet people to remind us what we've forgotten?" He stood moving closer, stopping just behind her. "And what did you forget, Clara?" She turned her head slightly, her eyes catching his. "That I'm still alive," Elias breathed out, a sound halfway between relief and ache. For a moment, time hung still between them, the air heavy with words neither dared to speak. Then he reached out, slowly, and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. His hand lingered near her cheek, rough and warm. "Guess I forgot that too," he said softly. And then, as if the world outside held its breath, they stayed that way, close enough to feel each other's warmth, far enough that neither one crossed the line of grief and tenderness that separated them. When he finally stepped back, he said quietly, "Get some rest, Clara. Tomorrow the roads will be clear." She nodded. But as he turned toward the door, her voice stopped him. "Elias," he looked over his shoulder, "if the roads are clear tomorrow, would you still take me south?" He smiled faintly, eyes soft. "Only if you ask me to." And then he left her standing by the window, the faint glow of dawn starting to touch the snow outside, and in her heart, for the first time in months, something that felt almost like hope began to bloom. When morning came, the snow had softened to slush, and a faint mist rose from the fields. The Carters' ranch stood quiet in the pale light, its smoke curling thinly into the sky. For the first time in days, the air carried the scent of thawing earth, a promise that winter, though not yet gone, was loosening its grip. Clara woke early, drawn by the sound of hooves outside. She found Elias in the yard, tightening the saddle straps on his mare. The snow beneath his boots was streaked with meltwater, and sunlight glimmered across the ice like scattered glass. "You're leaving," she said quietly, stepping onto the porch. He looked up, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "Carter says the road south is clear enough. Figured I'd get you to the next town before nightfall." She folded her arms against the chill. "You could stay another day," he smiled faintly. "And Miss Fairweather?" Not likely. But the way he said it, soft, careful, told her he'd considered staying, maybe even wanted to. Mrs. Carter appeared behind her, a kind smile on her face and a small bundle of food wrapped in cloth. "Here, dear. For the road." You two take care out there. Clara thanked her, her heart tightening. This warmth, this brief piece of home, she didn't want to let it go. But when Elias mounted and offered her his hand, something inside her whispered that maybe the road ahead wasn't an ending after all. She climbed up behind him, and once again they rode into the endless white. The world stretched quiet and wide. The sun hung low in the sky, weak but steady, and every hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat across the frozen plains. Elias guided the mare carefully through patches of mud and snow, his voice low when he spoke to calm her. Clara leaned lightly against his back, her hands gripping the sides of the saddle, close enough to feel his warmth, not close enough to show what her heart wanted. After a long silence, she said, "You never told me what made you stop at that station." He hesitated before answering. "Truth is, I wasn't planning to. I'd been riding through for days, headed south toward the border. Saw the storm building and figured I'd wait it out. So you just happened to stop where I was?" "Maybe not by chance," he said quietly. "Sometimes the trail puts people in your path for a reason." Clara smiled faintly. "You sound like Mrs. Carter. She's wiser than both of us put together." They rode on, the wind brushing their faces. Eventually, they stopped by a half-frozen stream to rest the horse. Elias helped her down, and she knelt by the water, cupping it in her hands. It was bitterly cold but clear as glass. She looked at her reflection, pale, worn, but somehow lighter. "You ever think about going back?" she asked without looking up. "To Silver Bend?" he asked. "To anywhere that hurt you." He crouched beside her, picking up a pebble and tossing it into the stream. "All the time. But I learned something out here. You can't fix the past by staring at it. You just ride until you find a place that feels quiet again." She looked at him then, her eyes catching the faint glimmer of sunlight on his face. "And have you found that quiet?" Not yet. The air hung still between them. She could feel the pull of his words, the weight of everything he didn't say. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand where it rested on his knee. He didn't pull away. "Maybe quiet doesn't come from where you ride," she said softly. "Maybe it comes from who rides beside you." Elias's breath caught, and when he turned toward her, his expression was raw, unguarded. He searched her face as if trying to be sure she meant it. When he spoke, his voice was rough but tender. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she said, shaking her head. "But it's real." They stayed like that for a while, two broken souls sitting by a frozen stream, their hands barely touching, the world around them holding still as if afraid to break the moment. When they finally rode on, something between them had changed. The distance that once felt necessary was gone. They spoke more freely now, about the little things, the kind that make up real life. He told her about the color of the sunsets near the Rio Grande, about the night he'd slept under thunder so loud it shook the earth. She told him about her father's old piano, about how she used to hum to herself when she was scared as a child. And somewhere along that winding, half-frozen trail, laughter returned. Quiet at first, uncertain, like a bird testing the air, but then stronger, warmer, the kind that heals without warning. By dusk, they reached a small ridge overlooking the valley. Below in the distance, a faint cluster of lights shimmered like gold dust in the fog. "Town's down there," Elias said, reining in the horse. "You'll find a stagecoach in the morning." Clara was quiet for a long time. The lights flickered below like stars fallen to earth. "You'll be leaving after that, won't you?" she asked finally. He nodded. "I have to." "Why?" "Because if I stay, I might forget why I was leaving." She turned toward him, eyes glistening. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." He looked at her then, and the world seemed to stop breathing. The snow, the wind, even the horse went still. For a heartbeat, everything in his life, every road, every ghost, led to this moment. "I told myself I wouldn't feel this again," he said softly. "That I couldn't, but you—" Clara's voice trembled. "Then don't fight it." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "You don't know what you're asking, Clara." "Yes, I do," she whispered. "I'm asking you to stop running." He leaned closer, his breath warm against the cold air. "And what if running is all I know? Then let me teach you something else." The words hung between them, fragile, trembling, and before either could speak again, he kissed her. It was slow, hesitant at first, but it deepened with every heartbeat, every breath that melted the cold between them. It wasn't the desperate kind of love born from loneliness. It was something steadier, something that felt like coming home after a long, hard winter. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke. The snow whispered around them, soft and forgiving. Elias pressed his forehead to hers, eyes closed. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. "Then let it be a gift," she said. For a long while, they stayed like that, two souls thawed by something the storm couldn't bury. The blizzard had long passed. Days turned to weeks and weeks to months. The station, once buried under layers of silence and snow, now breathed again with the coming of spring. The rails shone faintly under the morning sun, and the prairie grass swayed like it was whispering forgotten secrets to the wind. Clara stood at the same bench where she had once sat, shivering and lost. But this time she wasn't alone. Ethan was beside her, his arm resting lightly on her shoulders, a quiet strength that had become her home. In front of them, the old telegraph post was still there, but the wires had been repaired, humming faintly with new life. She smiled at it. The sound had always reminded her of ghosts whispering, but now it was more like a promise. "You ever think about that night?" she asked softly. Ethan chuckled, his eyes squinting at the horizon. "Every time the snow falls, I do. You sitting there with frost on your lashes, looking like you'd just stepped out of heaven and into hell." Clara laughed gently, the kind of laugh that comes from deep healing. "And you looked like trouble," she teased. "That coat, that silence, that way you stared like you were weighing my soul." "I was," he said quietly. Then after a pause, "Didn't know I was weighing my own, too." She looked up at him. Her cowboy, the man who had walked out of the storm like a memory, and stayed like a vow. They'd spent months together on his ranch, mending fences, breaking horses, sharing silence by the fire. Sometimes he'd play an old tune on the harmonica, and she'd hum along. Other times they'd just sit, saying nothing, because love, in its truest form, didn't need words. But the past had a way of calling. Clara had dreams, unfinished ones. A teaching position in St. Louis that she'd once abandoned after her fiancé died in the war. Now, the letter she had sent months ago had returned with an answer, an offer. She held it in her hands now, folded and worn. Ethan had seen it, read it even. He never told her what to do. That was the thing about him. He never tried to hold her still, only gave her the courage to move. "You think you'll take it?" he asked finally. She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I think I have to try." Ethan took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and nodded too. "Then you should go." They stood there as the whistle of the incoming train cut through the prairie wind, a low, steady sound that carried both endings and beginnings. When the locomotive finally appeared, churning steam into the sky, Clara turned to him. Her hand lingered on his chest. "You could come with me," she whispered. He smiled sadly. "And leave the ranch, the horses, the ghosts I still ain't done making peace with?" He shook his head. "No, Clara, you go and live. That's what we were both meant to do." She swallowed hard, blinking fast. "Will I see you again?" Ethan looked down at her, then leaned in and kissed her, soft, deep and slow, like a promise meant to last across miles. When they parted, his voice broke. "If the snow falls again, look out your window." "I'll be somewhere under it," the train hissed. The conductor called. Clara climbed aboard, her heart breaking and mending all at once. Through the window, she saw him step back, hat in hand, watching her leave. As the train pulled away, the world blurred into motion, rails humming, wind howling, tears falling. But in that blur, she saw something clear. A man standing alone at a station that had once been a graveyard for hope, now watching the future ride away, and she smiled. Because for the first time since she lost everything, Clara didn't feel lost anymore. She carried him with her, in the rhythm of the wheels, in the sound of the wind, in the quiet strength that love leaves behind when it refuses to fade, and far behind, Ethan stood until the train became nothing but a shimmer in the distance. Then he turned back toward the open land, toward the fences that needed mending, toward the life that, somehow, she had brought back to him. That night, as the sun died over the prairie, he looked up at the stars and whispered, "Safe travels." "Clara." The wind carried it east, soft and sure, as if answering him with her voice. "I'm already home."